Good morning and good afternoon. My name is Danya Popov, and welcome to my talk on features versus releases. The best product teams tend to have one thing in common: they iterate rapidly, and yet iOS teams consistently struggle to do this. Conventional wisdom is that features dictate when a release occurs. I will argue that this is not how it should be. A bit about me. I'm the founding iOS engineer at Open. We are a mindfulness company, and our product aims to help people create a practice at home and visit our studios in person. Now let's talk about what happens on iOS teams in general. If I would imagine everyone here has heard these lines. Can we get this into the next release? We can't ship this until it's perfect. Just one more feature. This ends up creating a situation where a release becomes a Sisyphean task. It snowballs and grows and becomes a thing that you just can't wrangle. It becomes more and more difficult to test. It becomes a thing that keeps getting pushed back until a given feature makes its way into the product, until a given feature is stabilized, until that feature hasn't accidentally broken something else. And what you're left with is a situation where you haven't released in a few weeks, maybe even a month, and in the meanwhile, the version that's out in the wild has completely drifted from the one that you are now on, and it's even more difficult to maintain existing versions with dot releases if you're able to do it at all. And you're in this position where you have become too precious with the release that you're currently working on. It's become far too difficult for you to actually get it out the door. Honestly, what's most surprising about this is that this whole approach seems completely in contrast to the way we think about the way that startups or web teams operate. When you hear about a startup, you hear about the fact that they are constantly designing and building and iterating and testing. The same thing with web teams. You hear the constant, the famous lines of build fast and fail fast. Or Reid Hoffman's idea, if you're not embarrassed by the first version of your product, you've launched it too late. All of these are completely at odds with the way that iOS teams tend to operate. And what I would argue is instead, we should actually divide the idea of the way we think about feature-led development and releasing versus release-led development and releasing. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. In the traditional idea of feature-driven development versus what I'm calling release-driven development, in feature-driven development, it ends up becoming slow. You end up delaying until you actually have the feature ready, the thing snowballs and potentially spirals out of control. In release-driven development, you instead let the release actually function independent of the features. We, at our team, release every single week. It doesn't matter if a feature has made it. It doesn't matter if we haven't figured out some new functionality. We are going to make a release. We keep the rest of the functionality feature flagged out, and we continue to move the product forward. It allows us to submit dot releases faster, it allows us to iterate faster, and it allows us to keep the product that we're working on more in sync with the product that is out in the wild. We actually reflect this in everything down to the actual version numbers. In traditional feature-driven development, you'll often see versions that look like this: version 1.2 versus 1.3. As new features come in, they'll be 1.3, maybe they'll even be 1.3.1. We instead actually derive our version numbers from time. Our version numbers are version 22.43, for example, 22 being the year that it came out and 43 being the week it came out, since we are releasing every week. This allows us to actually completely separate just the idea even of when a release happened. It allows us to look back in time. If we know that a bug was introduced in a certain given week, we know what version was out in that week. So how do we actually do this? Well, we've built a system on top of Bitrise that helps us to actually manage this daily and weekly. This looks like a very complicated diagram here, but underneath the hood, what it really means is we have a release that we're able to send out every day, which creates two versions that are managed internally, and a weekly pipeline that generates our actual release candidates, which are also ultimately tested internally. And in this way, we're actually able to manage, with a very small engineering team, 3 apps, 2 internal and 1 actually external, for our team. Operationally, how do we do this? We have a weekly schedule that we keep to. Every Thursday, we make a cut. That cut is a Git branch that is frozen and is a representation of a release that went out that given week. A release manager will prep a summary of what's actually being released and will potentially create a schedule for a bug bash as necessary if the features that are going out are larger. We'll also work closely with our design team to allow them to create space for any VQA tickets or any reviews for heavy design functionality that's going out in a given build. We'll also start to alert the team at large that we have a release that's going to be coming out. Every Friday, we send out a message to the company at large about the fact that we have a new release that's a release candidate, and we would like them to help us dog food it. Our team, if necessary again, will run a bigger bug bash on any critical flows or any new introduced functionality. And by end of Friday, we should have an idea of where we're at with certain features. Are they actually going to make this release, or are we instead going to hold them back and continue to iterate them on for a future release? Over the weekend and up to Monday, the app will continue to be tested. And come Monday morning, we will review tickets that have come in, both from the design team and from the team at large, and understand where we're at with the release. Are there things that we need to pull out, or are we on track to a point where we can be submitting by end of day, with a goal that come Tuesday or Wednesday, Apple has reviewed and approved us, and we can continue the cycle again. Thursday, make another cut, and release the subsequent week. In this way, we're able to use the weekend as a time for the app to essentially be frozen, and we call it baking, essentially, where we are allowing functionality to be more rigorously tested internally, where we're not constantly changing it and constantly updating it. And to the previous slide, those internal versions continue to be created every morning off of our main develop branch. That is functionality that the engineering team is testing, that is functionality that the design team might be looking at, but the broader team at large is focusing on helping us breadcrumb and dog food our main app, which is actually the app that's going to go out to our customers. Now, as you're listening to this, I suspect that some of you are seeing some perceived costs that I would argue are actually benefits of setting a system like this up. One, very likely one, is that you're too small of a team. Now, this whole system is actually modeled on my previous company, Airbnb's system. They also release every week. And when I was starting to set up our systems, I thought a lot about the fact that they did this for a large company. But what the success there that I saw, I thought actually would help even more for our smaller team. With our small team, we've actually been able to create a lot of leverage out of this. Our 3 engineers have been able to do more because we have a system that we can rely on, because we understand that we are shipping a product every week. It's something for us to align on, and we know when a given feature is ready and we can include it into a given release. Just allows us to operate, I think, much more efficiently. It's too difficult, for example. Or maybe you would argue it's too much overhead. I would argue instead that these are things that actually create stability. They are things that improve visibility from the company at large. We've managed to create a lot more buy-in from the larger team when they understand what we're working on. If you just continue to delay an iOS release because it's not ready for engineering reasons, then the team at large doesn't know why a given feature hasn't shipped. If every week instead there is a version going out and you're including release notes of what made it, what didn't make it, and maybe even what's going to be coming the following week, you're able to get a lot more buy-in from the team at large and understand that, oh, this is what's happening. This is how fast the team is moving. These are things that are actually happening. And it just helps a lot with kind of the general product excitement, I would even say. You could also argue it's a distraction, or that it creates even more slowness, or it's just costly. And again, I would argue instead that this creates the alignment I was just talking about. It allows us to actually fulfill our promise of iteration, and ultimately I think it even actually encourages speed. And this is more anecdotal than anything else, but we've been measuring, and from our perspective, when we are more regular in our submissions, our App Store reviews tend to actually go smoother. We tend to actually have them be reviewed faster, and on weeks where we slip a little bit, our reviews take a little bit longer. Now, Apple review team is notoriously a black box, so this all could be completely coincidental, but this is what we have observed. At this point, I hope that you have seen what I would argue are a lot of the benefits from actually separating what I would consider being the feature-led idea of development versus what I call the release-led idea of development. And I will now open it up for questions. Thank you.